According to Keynes, people driven by animal spirits to action would be thrifty when they were worried about the economy, pulling their money out of the circular flow and bringing on the downturn they feared. With sticky prices and wages, the deflationary spiral would wreak havoc on business, and production would sputter to a halt in many sectors of the economy, leaving huge chunks of the labor force unemployed, while banks packed their vaults with money rather than lending it out. The thriftiness dried up the consumer demand, and uncertainty stopped banking from making up the difference by financing investment spending. These idle resources were just left unused by a broken economy that wasn't going to be able to heal itself until either the consumer spending or the investment spending rose to the occasion. And that wasn't going to happen so long as the uncertainty about the future continued. Adam Smith and his contemporaries had ushered in an era of prosperity by calling for economic freedom and laissez-faire policies that kept the government from getting involved. The incredible success of those ideas cannot be denied, but the economy that rose up around those ideas was not as efficient and self-correcting as it seemed. It was prone to fluctuations in credit driven by banking panics that made investment spending unpredictable. The first response was to try to shore up those financial markets and back them with a central bank. But laissez-faire thinking was so strong that even the Fed balked at the level of intervention that might be required of them. What Keynes delivered was an intellectual framework for rethinking those presumptions. He was influenced by the common sense philosophy practiced by Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, and his work changed the minds of the ruling class while Franklin Roosevelt was pressing forward with or without them on the same ideas. What Keynes was proposing was a program of countercyclical fiscal policy, engineered by the government. When the economy was booming, governments should swing the other way by raising taxes and lowering government spending. Higher taxes would push down overzealous consumer spending, while reduced government spending would counter excess in investment spending and keep the government's finances in order, running a surplus of funds to be saved for later when the economy entered a recession. That's when the government was advised to cut taxes, encouraging consumer spending, and to raise government spending. This would mean a budget deficit, which would be covered by borrowing the idle funds sitting in banks, which ought to be going to investment spending. In essence, if the problem in a recession is too much saving and not enough investment, the government could cover the extra savings by lowering taxes and take over the role of investment through government spending. Once the economy got going again and we reached another economic boom, the government would swing the other way once again and pay down their debts by running a budget surplus. The objection many had was whether or not the government could even manage this. In the 1930s, government spending was only about 10% of GDP. The Great Depression shrunk the economy by half, and many questioned if it was even possible for government spending to make up that difference and not end up bankrupting itself, making the crisis even worse. But the key to Keynes's idea was that resources were idle, and so the government would only need to spend a small fraction of what was needed to make up the difference. The marginal propensity to consume, MPC, is the proportion of new income a typical person spends on consumption, as opposed to saving it. When anyone spends money, it ends up as income for someone else, who will spend some portion of it themselves, becoming income for another person, and on this goes. The initial spending kicks off a chain reaction of additional spending. It may be that some people spend everything they earn, while others spend very little, choosing to save most of what they earn. But aggregated together, the overall economy is spending some fraction of the additional income earned. And that means we can use a similar shortcut to figuring out the impact of an additional dollar's worth of spending on the overall economy. The expenditure multiplier is that shortcut. The expenditure multiplier tells us how much $1 of initial spending will increase GDP. To find the expenditure multiplier, all you need to know is the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. The formula is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. Here's an example. If the government borrows and spends an additional $5 billion, like they did with the Works Progress Administration during the Depression, and the marginal propensity to consume is 75%, meaning people typically spend 75 cents for every additional dollar they earn, a reasonable estimate for the time. What impact will it have on GDP? The expenditure multiplier would then be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, which works out to 4. The multiplier is the thing you multiply the spending by, and so we take the $5 billion in spending and multiply it by 4 to get a total effect of $20 billion. So for every dollar the government spent, GDP rose by $4. The expenditure multiplier isn't a magic wand. During normal times with a healthy economy, an increase in government spending would steal resources away from private consumption and investment, and so the government spending would be offset by reductions in consumption and investment. And the increase in GDP from the government spending would be offset by the decrease in GDP from the reduced consumption and investment spending. But during an event like the Great Depression, there are a huge number of idle resources going unused. The additional government spending makes use of those idle resources, and so it is not offset by reductions anywhere else. In fact, the idea is that by employing those idle resources, the government spending spurs on more consumer spending, and the added confidence in the economy spurs on more investment spending, so that the moderate amount of government spending can actually result in a large increase in total GDP, reinflating the economy to support the wages and prices stuck in place and ending the paradox of thrift. Within a few short decades, Keynes had convinced the economic profession and the economists the world over, successfully convinced just about every government in the world, to try out this newfangled Keynesian economics. And with FDR as our guide, it really seemed to be working.